3 in the morning. That's when everything changes in an emergency room. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting that familiar cold glow across empty gurneys and sterile floors. I was finishing my charting when the ambulance bay doors burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, and on it lay a man who would force me to confront a past I thought I'd left behind forever. He had no identification, no wallet, nothing. His clothes were worn, but clean. But what caught my attention wasn't what he had. It was what he didn't have, a pulse I could feel. My name is Lauren Matthews, and I've been a critical care nurse for 12 years. I've worked in hospitals across 3 continents, from the pristine facilities of Boston to makeshift field hospitals in places most people only see on the news. I've held the hands of dying soldiers, delivered babies in war zones, and watched miracles happen when everything said they shouldn't. But nothing prepared me for the moment I turned that man's body to check for injuries and saw the mark behind his shoulder. A mark I recognized immediately, a mark that told me this wasn't just another patient. This was someone whose life had intersected with mine in the most unexpected way possible. And what I was about to discover would shake everything I thought I knew about fate, duty, and the invisible threads that connect us all. The paramedic's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade. Approximately 45-year-old male, found unresponsive in a downtown parking garage. No signs of trauma, vitals critically unstable. I moved into position immediately, my hands already reaching for his neck to confirm what the paramedics had told me. Nothing, no pulse. His skin was cool but not cold, which meant we still had time. Not much, but enough. Code blue, I called out, and the emergency room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses appeared from every direction. The crash cart rolled in, and I began chest compressions while someone else prepared the defibrillator. His chest was broader than average, muscular despite his age. This wasn't someone who'd let himself go. Someone hooked him up to the monitor, and I watched the flat line dance across the screen. We had to move fast. During the 3rd round of compressions, I noticed something. His skin had unusual markings. Not tattoos exactly, but faint scars that seemed deliberately placed. They ran along his rib cage in a pattern I'd seen before, but couldn't immediately place. We shocked him once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, the monitor beeped, showing a weak but present rhythm. We had him back, but barely. I ordered a full workup, blood tests, imaging, everything. We needed to know what caused this. As the team worked around me, I did what I always do. I examined every inch of my patient for clues. That's when I saw it. I needed to turn him slightly to check for back injuries, and when I did, there it was. Behind his right shoulder, partially hidden by his shoulder blade, was a very specific type of scar. It wasn't from an accident or a typical surgery. It was a tactical medical procedure scar, the kind performed on special operations soldiers who needed emergency field treatment for shrapnel wounds. I'd seen this exact type of scar dozens of times before, but only in one place, a place I'd tried very hard to forget. If this story has already grabbed your attention, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. And tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love knowing this story is reaching people everywhere. My hands were shaking as I stepped back from the patient. Nobody else in the room had noticed. They were too focused on stabilizing his vitals, running tests, inserting lines, but I noticed. That scar was like a signature, and I knew exactly who had performed that type of surgery. Dr. Hassan Rahimi, a brilliant trauma surgeon I'd worked with 5 years ago in a coalition hospital in the Middle East. He only performed that particular technique on operators who were part of classified missions, soldiers whose names never appeared in any official records. The patient was being moved to intensive care, and I followed, my mind racing through memories I'd locked away. The desert heat, the constant sound of helicopters, the smell of sand and antiseptic mixing in the air. I'd spent 14 months in that hospital, treating everyone from local civilians to wounded soldiers from 6 different countries. It was the hardest and most meaningful work I'd ever done, but it was also where I'd lost a part of myself I could never get back. I pulled up a chair next to his bed in the ICU and watched the monitors. His heart rate was stabilizing, blood pressure slowly climbing. Whoever he was a fighter. I started going through the admission paperwork, hoping for any clue about his identity. No insurance cards, no emergency contacts, no phone. Just a set of keys and $43 in cash. The police would run his fingerprints, but something told me that wouldn't lead anywhere useful. Men like him, if my suspicions were correct, they knew how to disappear. 3 hours later, his eyes opened. Not gradually, not confused like most patients waking up from a cardiac event. His eyes snapped open with immediate awareness, scanning the room for threats before landing on me. And in that moment, I saw recognition flash across his face. He knew me, just like I was beginning to realize I knew him. Thank you for staying with me this far. It means you're feeling what I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell, because what comes next changes everything. I need to take you back 5 years to help you understand what happened next. Back to when I was a different person, younger and still believing I could save everyone. The field hospital was located in a compound protected by concrete walls and sandbags, 30 miles from the nearest major city. We treated an average of 50 patients a day, everything from dehydration to gunshot wounds. The work was relentless, but it gave me purpose. One night in July, we received word that a convoy had been hit, multiple casualties incoming. We prepared for the worst, and the worst arrived. 6 soldiers, 3 local contractors, all with varying degrees of trauma. The most critical was a sniper who'd taken shrapnel to his back and shoulder when an IED exploded near his position. He was unconscious when they brought him in, bleeding heavily. Dr. Rahimi worked on him for 4 hours straight while I assisted, managing his vitals and keeping him stable. The injury was severe enough that it required the specialized procedure I mentioned earlier, cutting and removing fragments embedded dangerously close to his spine. If we'd waited even another hour, he would have been paralyzed or dead. I remember his face, even though he was unconscious the entire time. Strong jawline, a small scar above his left eyebrow, dark hair cut military short. He survived the surgery, but the recovery was complicated. Infection set in, and for 3 days we fought to keep him alive while his fever raged. I stayed with him during my shifts, and even during some of my off hours, monitoring him, adjusting medications, talking to him even though he couldn't hear me. That's what we did there. We treated them like human beings, not just bodies to repair. On the 4th day, his fever broke. He woke up briefly, looked directly at me with those intense eyes, and said 2 words, "Thank you." Then he slipped back into medicated sleep. A week later, he was evacuated to a facility in Germany for continued care, and I never saw him again. Until now. Apparently, because the man in the ICU bed, the man whose heart I'd just restarted, had the same scar above his left eyebrow, the same intense eyes, the same face that had been etched in my memory for 5 years. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. When he fully regained consciousness 12 hours after admission, he didn't speak immediately. He just watched me as I checked his vitals, updated his chart, adjusted his IV fluids. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken recognition. Finally, I broke it. "You had no pulse when you arrived," I said, keeping my voice professional. "We had to resuscitate you 4 times. Do you remember anything before you collapsed?" He studied me for a long moment before responding. His voice was rough, probably from the intubation tube we'd had down his throat. "I remember feeling dizzy," he said. "I was walking to my truck, and then everything went dark. I pulled up a stool and sat down, holding my tablet, but not really looking at it. We need to run more tests to figure out what caused this," I explained. "Have you had any heart problems before? Any family history?" He shook his head slowly. "No family history, but I've had some issues the last few years. Irregular heartbeat, chest pain." I ignored it. Of course he did. Men like him always ignored warning signs until their bodies gave them no choice. "I need to ask you something," I said, deciding to be direct. "That scar on your shoulder, where did you get it?" His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a calculation happening behind them. "Why do you want to know?" he asked. "Because I've seen that specific surgical technique before," I replied. "Only in one place. And if I'm right about where you got it, then you and I have met before, even if you don't remember." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I remember you," he said, "your voice. You talked to me when I was unconscious. You told me about your hometown in Oregon, about the rain and the trees. You said if I could just hold on, I'd see rain again." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had told him that. I'd rambled to him during those long hours when his fever was critical, talking about anything to fill the silence, to make him feel less alone. I never thought he'd heard any of it. Over the next 2 days, he told me his story in fragments, pieces offered carefully like someone handling broken glass. His name was Marcus Webb. Not his real name, he admitted, but the one he'd been using for the past 3 years since leaving military service. He'd been a Marine sniper for 16 years, most of that time spent in classified operations that would never appear in any official record. The work had taken him to 23 countries, into situations most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't want to. He'd saved lives, he said, but he'd also taken them, more than he could count, more than he wanted to remember. "When you're looking through a scope," he explained, "they're just targets, threats to eliminate. But later, in the quiet, you remember they were people. They had families. They had lives. And you're the one who ended those lives." The words came out flat, emotionless, but I could see the weight of them in his eyes. This was a man carrying ghosts. After the injury I treated, he'd been medically retired. The damage to his shoulder had been too extensive for him to maintain the physical standards required for his position. He'd received his discharge papers, his benefits, and a handshake. Then he'd been left to figure out how to exist in a world that didn't make sense anymore. How do you go from making life and death decisions every day to standing in line at a grocery store? He asked. How do you sleep in a quiet room when you're used to the sound of mortars in the distance? How do you connect with people when you can't tell them anything real about who you are or what you've done? He'd drifted for a while, moving from city to city, taking odd jobs that required minimal interaction. Security work mostly, the kind where you stand around looking intimidating and pray nothing actually happens. He'd ended up in our city 8 months ago, working nights at a warehouse, living alone in a studio apartment with nothing but a mattress, a TV, and too many memories. The heart condition, he'd developed it gradually. Stress-induced cardiomyopathy, the doctors would later confirm. Years of extreme physical and psychological stress had literally damaged his heart muscle. It was rare, but not unheard of in combat veterans, and he'd ignored every warning sign until his heart simply gave up. On the 3rd day, I brought him his test results, and the truth I'd been avoiding. Your heart is damaged, I said, sitting down beside his bed. The condition is serious, but it's treatable with surgery. Without it, you'll have maybe 6 months. With it, you could have decades. He nodded, like I just told him the weather forecast. When? He asked. We need to schedule it soon, I replied. Within the next 2 weeks ideally. But Marcus, there's something else I need to tell you. I paused, gathering my words. I've been thinking about where you were when I treated you 5 years ago. The hospital, the timing, everything. And I remember something else from that period, something that happened 3 weeks after your surgery. He turned to look at me directly, and I saw understanding dawn in his eyes. The convoy attack, he said quietly. You remember it? I nodded, feeling emotion rise in my throat. Our medical convoy was returning from a civilian clinic when we were ambushed. 3 vehicles, 15 medical personnel, all of us unarmed. We should have died that day. The attackers had the high ground. They had us pinned down, and we had nowhere to go. But someone started returning fire from a distance. Precision shots that took out the attackers one by one, giving us time to retreat to safety. We never knew who it was. The official report credited air support, but there were no helicopters in the area. Someone on the ground saved us, and then disappeared. Marcus was staring at the ceiling now, his jaw tight. I was supposed to be on medical leave, he said, still recovering from the surgery. But I'd heard chatter about increased activity in that sector, and I knew the medical teams went out there. I couldn't sit in that hospital bed knowing you were out there unprotected. So I left against orders, took my rifle, and positioned myself on a ridge overlooking the route I knew you'd take. When I saw the ambush starting, I didn't think. I just acted. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. You saved my life, I whispered. You saved all of us, and I never knew. He turned back to me, and for the first time I saw something other than emptiness in his expression. I saw pain and regret, and something that might have been hope. You gave me my life back in that operating room, he said. I just tried to return the favor. The revelation changed everything between us. Not professionally, I still maintained my role as his nurse. But there was a connection now, acknowledged and impossible to ignore. We'd saved each other's lives, years apart, without even realizing the full circle we'd completed. Over the next few days, as we prepared for his surgery, Marcus opened up more. He told me that after leaving the military, he'd tried to find me. He'd spent months searching through what limited information he could access, trying to track down the nurse who'd cared for him, who'd talked to him about rain and trees and hope. When he'd finally found records indicating I was working at a hospital in this city, he'd made his way here. Not to contact me directly, he'd explained. He didn't think I'd remember him, didn't think he had any right to interrupt my life. But he'd wanted to be near someone who'd seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't looked away, someone who'd treated him like a person worth saving. It's pathetic, isn't it? He'd said with a bitter laugh, 45 years old, following a woman across the country because she was kind to me once. I'd gripped his hand then, something I probably shouldn't have done but couldn't help. It's not pathetic, I'd said firmly. It's human. You were looking for connection, for proof that you're more than what you were trained to be. There's nothing wrong with that. But there were complications beyond the emotional ones. His medical history was raising flags throughout the hospital system. Someone had noticed the classified nature of his past service, and suddenly there were questions. Who was this man? What had he done? Did he deserve the kind of specialized, expensive care his condition required? I'd faced a meeting with the hospital administration, where 3 executives questioned whether we should proceed with the surgery. His history is concerning, one of them had said. We have limited resources, and other patients with less complicated backgrounds. I'd stood my ground, probably more forcefully than I should have. His background is irrelevant to his medical needs, I'd argued. He's a veteran who served his country. He deserves the same care we'd give anyone else. In the end, they'd approved the surgery, but the whole experience had left a bitter taste. Marcus had been right. Society wanted soldiers when they needed them, but didn't want to deal with what those soldiers became afterward. The days leading up to the surgery were tense. We'd found a cardiac surgeon willing to take the case, Dr. Patricia Chen, one of the best in the state. But even she'd admitted the odds weren't great. His heart muscle had deteriorated significantly, and the scar tissue from years of stress made the surgery more complex than usual. There was a 30% chance he wouldn't survive the procedure. Marcus took the news calmly, signing all the consent forms without hesitation. But I could see the fear beneath the stoic exterior. He'd faced death dozens of times in combat, but this was different. This was his body failing him from the inside, a battle he couldn't shoot his way out of. The night before the surgery, I stayed late, sitting with him in his room after my shift officially ended. We didn't talk much. Sometimes silence is its own form of communication. Finally, he spoke. "If I don't make it tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. These last 2 weeks, being here, talking to you, remembering that there are still good people in the world, it's been the most peaceful I've felt in 5 years. That's not nothing." I had to look away to hide the tears forming in my eyes. "You're going to make it," I said, trying to sound confident. "Dr. Chen is excellent. The team is prepared, and you're stronger than you think." He smiled, a real smile this time, not the bitter half-smirk he usually wore. "You're still doing it," he said, "still trying to give me hope, still talking me through the dark. That's who you are. Some people break things. You put them back together." I left the hospital that night, carrying the weight of his words. He was wrong about one thing, though. I didn't put things back together. I just helped people find the strength to put themselves back together. There's a difference. The surgery was scheduled for 7 in the morning. I wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't my unit, and I wasn't part of the surgical team. But I showed up anyway, scrubbed in as an observer, and stood in that operating room watching Dr. Chen work for 6 hours straight, watching her carefully repair the damaged muscle, bypass the blocked arteries, give Marcus the chance at life his body had been denying him. When his heart started beating on its own again, strong and steady, I finally let myself cry behind my surgical mask. He'd made it. Against the odds, he'd survived. The recovery was long and difficult. Marcus spent 3 days in intensive care before being moved to a regular room. His body had been through trauma, and it needed time to heal. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. During his recovery, something unexpected happened. Word had spread about his case, and a journalist had gotten hold of the story. Not the full story, but enough. Local veteran receives life-saving surgery after cardiac emergency. It should have been a positive human interest piece, but it took a different turn. The journalist had dug into his background, found hints of his classified service, and started asking questions. What exactly had he done during his military career? How many people had he killed? Did someone with his history deserve expensive medical resources when others were waiting? The article was published in the local newspaper, and suddenly Marcus was at the center of a controversy he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. I was furious. I'd written a response op-ed that the newspaper had declined to publish, citing editorial standards. So I'd posted it on social media instead, where it had gotten more attention than I'd expected. In it, I'd defended Marcus and called out the hypocrisy of a society that sent young people to war and then condemned them for doing what they'd been trained to do. The response was mixed. Some people supported my stance, sharing their own stories of veteran family members struggling to reintegrate. Others accused me of defending a killer, of ignoring the moral questions his service raised. The hospital administration wasn't happy. I'd been called into another meeting, this time with a warning about maintaining professional boundaries and avoiding public controversies that reflected poorly on the institution. I'd accepted the reprimand without argument, but I didn't regret what I'd done. Marcus had been sitting in his hospital bed reading some of the comments on my post when I'd walked in for my shift. "You didn't have to do that," he'd said without looking up. "Now you're taking heat because of me." I'd pulled up a chair and sat down, tired but resolute. "Yes, I did have to do that," I'd replied, "because what they're doing to you is wrong. You served your country. You did things most people can't imagine because you were asked to, and now you're being judged by people who've never had to make those kinds of choices." He'd finally looked at me then, and I'd seen something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Recognition that he wasn't alone anymore, that someone was willing to stand beside him, even when it cost something. 3 weeks after the surgery, Marcus was discharged. His heart was functioning well, his vitals were stable, and he had a comprehensive outpatient care plan. Physically, he was on the road to recovery, but we both knew that the physical healing was only part of the battle. On his last day in the hospital, we had a final conversation that I'll remember for the rest of my life. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, dressed in regular clothes for the first time since he'd arrived, looking more like a real person and less like a patient. I sat down beside him, clipboard forgotten in my lap. "How are you feeling?" I'd asked, the question carrying more weight than usual. "Scared," he'd admitted. That was new. In all our conversations, he'd never used that word. "I'm scared that I'll go back to that empty apartment and fall into the same patterns. Scared that I'll waste this second chance you all gave me. Scared that I don't know how to be a person anymore." I'd nodded, understanding completely. "The trauma you carry doesn't disappear because your heart is fixed. I'd said gently. You need help processing what you've experienced. Real help from someone trained in trauma therapy. Will you promise me you'll follow up with the Veterans Counseling Services? He'd promised, and I'd believed him. But there was something else I needed to say, something I'd been thinking about since the night before his surgery. You told me that some people break things and some put them back together, I'd said. But I think you're wrong about which category you belong in. You protected people, Marcus. You saved lives, including mine. Yes, you also took lives, but you did it because you were asked to, because someone decided those were the choices that needed to be made. That doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. He'd looked at me with those intense eyes, and I'd seen them shimmer with unshed tears. How do I live with what I've done? He'd asked, his voice cracking. How do I wake up every day and not see their faces? I'd taken his hand, breaking protocol one final time. The same way I live with the patients I couldn't save, I'd said. The same way any of us live with our hardest moments. You acknowledge the pain, you carry it, but you don't let it define you. You find ways to honor those losses by living a life that matters, by being present, by helping others when you can, by accepting that you're worthy of peace, even when peace feels impossible. We'd sat there in silence for a long time, two people who'd seen too much darkness trying to find their way back to the light. When he'd finally stood to leave, he'd turned back to me one last time. Thank you, he'd said, for everything. Not just for saving my life, but for reminding me that my life was worth saving. I'd watched him walk out of the hospital that day, carrying a bag of medications and a folder full of follow-up appointments. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. I didn't know if the help he'd promised to seek would be enough. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Every person who walks through our doors carries invisible scars. Some from war, some from abuse, some from loss, some from choices they wish they could unmake. My job isn't to judge those scars or decide who deserves healing. My job is to see the human being beneath the damage and fight like hell to give them another chance. Because that's what healthcare really is. It's not just about fixing bodies. It's about recognizing that every life has value, every story deserves to be continued, and every person fighting their own private war deserves someone in their corner. Marcus taught me that lesson more powerfully than anyone else ever could, and I'll carry it with me for the rest of my career. Every single shift, every single patient. Because in the end, we're all just trying to survive our own battles. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give each other is the simple acknowledgement that we're worth fighting for. So now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance, regardless of their past? Have you ever been in a situation where you discovered something surprising about someone you were caring for? If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel for more real and emotional stories like this one. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video, where another nurse reveals a secret that changed her career forever. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more stories with you. Thank you for being here.